Everyone, welcome to the fourth session of the series Stealing the Earth, the conquering of Indigenous peoples, the role of Christianity, and what can bring about justice. My name is Bridget Cabrera, she, her, hers, and I'm the Executive Director of Methodist Federation for Social Action. We're an over 100-year-old faith-based policy and organizing network, and our mission is to mobilize, lead, and sustain a progressive United Methodist movement, energizing people to be agents of God's justice, peace, and reconciliation. We are so glad to be co-hosting this webinar series with our partners, the Native American International Caucus and United Methodists for Kairos Response. Today is our fourth session. It is called Centering and Othering, Elevating White Normativity, Suppressing Racial and Indigenous Identities. A few announcements for our call today. We are recording this webinar, and that recording will be shared in the coming days. And as you have questions, you can feel free to type them in the chat. You don't have to wait till we get to the Q&A portion. You can type them in at any time during our conversation today. And if you're noticing, we also have closed captioning available. It is being automatically generated. So do expect to see some errors in spelling and other things as those closed captioning is automatically generated. The Doctrine of Discovery, which was based on a series of 15th century papal bulls, is a body of international law developed by European powers at the beginning of the colonial project. Now, this body of law stated that any undiscovered, unchristian land could be claimed by the European power that discovered it. Now, this legal justification for the seizure and ownership of lands was also used by the US government. On the basis of the Doctrine of Discovery, early Supreme Court rulings declared that discovery of new lands gave the US government title to the lands. And this ideology justified the seizure of indigenous lands by arguing some form of entitlement, whether that be secular, such as the land is empty or underdeveloped, or the superiority of the colonizing power, or religious reasons such as manifest destiny or a similar theological claim. This ideology and rationalization for world conquest has had a devastating impact on Indigenous peoples in every corner of the globe. Today, we are pleased to have Kimberly Medicine Horn and Alvin Deer as our speakers. Our first speaker, Kimberly Medicine Horn Jackson, Ihanktawan Nation, MFA, MA in Intercultural Studies with a focus on Native Americans. Jackson is currently a full-time contract researcher with the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. She teaches an Indigenous research and writing course she created for NAICS, an Indigenous learning community. Jackson is co-editor for the Journal of NAICS, an Indigenous learning community. She is writing a dissertation for her PhD, study with NAICS and Whitley College at the University of Divinity, Australia. Please welcome Kimberly.
Hello, everyone. I see that we're all coming from different places in the United States. That's so exciting. I'm so happy that you're here. And I do want to thank you for inviting me to speak about the boarding school era. This is such an important part of our history that still many people do not know about. And that can throw people into like a grieving process. Oh, and I see hello from Canada too. That's great. I wanted to say something about any elders who are boarding school survivors that might be listening into the webinar today. My intent is to be respectful of the situation, your lived experiences, and I do not want to re-traumatize anyone by the information that I'm going to be talking about. And I do want to encourage you, because I know there are elder people from various nations who may not have ever told anyone about their experiences when they were in the boarding schools or when their family members were in the boarding schools. And I think that it would be appropriate here to say, whether you've never talked about your experience before or you've talked about it a great deal, please use self-care after engaging in a webinar like this, or sharing in an answering and question period with somebody you may know, because it may trigger some responses that you may not have been prepared for. So please do take good care of yourselves. And I'm going to give you a brief overview of the boarding schools. The National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition identifies between 357 and 367 boarding schools in the United States. 29 states housed boarding schools, with the top 5 states being Oklahoma with 83 schools, Arizona with 51 schools, Alaska with 33 schools, New Mexico with 26 schools, South Dakota with 25 schools. And these are the top 5 states. I also feel it's necessary to say that the definition of boarding school can change. So for the purposes of the research that I've been doing, these are assimilative boarding schools whose intent it was to erase any Native culture or any Native identity of the children who went to these schools. To add to that, there are 14 known denominations: the Catholic denomination with 80 schools, Presbyterians with 21, Quaker 15, Episcopal 9, Methodist 12, Baptist 4, Jesuit 4, Dutch Reformed 2, Evangelical 2, Mennonite 2, Protestant 2, Anglican 1, Seventh-day Adventist 1, and Unitarian 1. All these denominations were involved throughout the boarding school era. This information and more like it can be found on the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. They also have a curriculum. So if your church or your organization would like to provide more specific information than we can go over here, I would recommend that you visit the website. There were more than 350 government-funded and often church-run Indian boarding schools across the US in the 19th and 20th centuries. Indian children were forcibly abducted by government agents, sent to school hundreds of miles away, and beaten, starved, or otherwise abused when they spoke their native languages. Since the Western influx starting in the east of what is now known as the United States, newcomers wanted to own a piece of land and settle there with their families or those who survived the long journey. To do this, if anyone inhabited the land the settlers wanted, they had to be removed. And so acts of war that were genocidal practices were justified. If you dehumanize the people that are already there, it becomes okay to do whatever you want. So in other words, if they weren't human or defined as civilized, they could be eradicated by any means necessary to build what people like to think of as a Christian nation. One method used to solve the Indian problem, which is what Indigenous people have been referred to ever since the Western influx, was assimilation into white society. The boarding school era from 1869 to the 1960s came after acts of war were exhausted and had become too expensive. If the Indians couldn't all be killed in war, then certainly they could be coerced into becoming like white men, but only through the use of assimilating children. One of the most well-known boarding schools in the US is Carlisle Indian Industrial School from 1879 to 1918. And the founder, Richard Henry Pratt, is credited for saying, "Kill the Indian in him, save the man." He had this idea of immersing our Indigenous children under white assimilation so thoroughly that they would drown in it. The first group of students at Carlisle were Sioux children from the Rosebud and Oglala reservations, some as young as age 4. Indigenous children were voluntarily or forcefully removed. In some instances, the children were simply kidnapped from their homes. There are testimonies of Native children being taught how to hide themselves when the white man came around. In other cases, fathers were jailed or crops were destroyed to coerce the parents to relinquish their children, and there have been accounts of homes being burned. Before the boarding school era, church denominations started mission schools. Some of these were day schools where the children could return home from school, while others were boarding the children. In some cases, the mission schools housed orphans due to tuberculosis, the Spanish flu, diphtheria, or other illnesses that robbed the children of their parents or decimated villages. But even some of these schools were assimilative because students were forced to dress in white culture clothes and speak English. Many of these schools were shut down when the Civil War began and then were reopened after the war ended. And during this time, the government and the denominations may have funded these schools together to different degrees. In some areas, schools were necessary after forced marches of tribes out west for relocation. In many cases, no official records were kept during the entire time in which a school was open. Some schools only operated a short time before they closed because of a total destruction by fire or tornado. But what we found is that each school has a unique history. However, the schools engaged in abusing the children physically, mentally, intellectually, and spiritually. Some students report having good experiences, while others still cannot speak of what happened to them, and their deep trauma has been passed down through generations. And this is what we call intergenerational or historical trauma. Today, this is a brief overview of what the boarding schools have involved. And there is much more to know of the timeline of laws and the policies passed to support this type of removal. So we can trace a line of removal back to the Doctrine of Discovery. If we want to inhabit this land, it has to be empty. If we dehumanize Indigenous people so they don't exist as human beings, therefore the land is empty and it is ours for the taking. In my past 10 years of studying boarding schools, the reason it's a major passion of mine is because my mom is a boarding school survivor. And she was put into a boarding school around the age of 4 or 5 after her mother passed away and then her grandmother passed away. So she went to the Marty Indian School in South Dakota, and she was there until age 16. One of the consequences of the Doctrine of Discovery and all these different methods of Indian removal up to this point is when you have generations of children that grow up in an institution rather than a family setting, they don't know or are not confident in their ability to parent their own children. So it's very easy for social services or governments or religious denominations to undermine the parents' ability to care for their own kids. So I was part of the adoption project, or the adoption method of removal. That's another direct line of Indian removal. What I have learned from my mom, she survived the boarding school, and then she was one of 6 plaintiffs in a class action lawsuit that wanted to address the abuses of the children that they suffered while they were in this boarding school, incurred by the nuns and priests. And if they were awarded any monies for their case, they wanted to use them to build a healing center for the boarding school survivors. However, what they found in the state of South Dakota is that there was a law that came into effect, sort of like a statute of limitations. If this traumatic event had happened more than X amount of years, then it was no longer punishable, or the people who incurred the abuses would not be held responsible for what they did. In the United States and Christian imagination, the boarding schools were for the good. But anywhere abuse is used to cause suffering as a means to coerce people, especially children, to assimilate, one can see why author Kent Nerburn calls this legacy a dark stain in American history. And I know right now some of you might be hearing this information for the first time. There are so many people that want to know what they can do. And there are so many different answers to that. What's happening now in Indian country among various tribes, and I cannot speak for all tribes, I'm not a voice for all Indigenous people, just of the experiences in my family and in my study. Educate yourselves, continue to explore what are the things in American history that you haven't heard about, and then consider why that may have happened. Why don't you know? But Indigenous people are taking steps to engage in healing processes of their own. They are reclaiming language. They are reclaiming traditional ways where those feel like they have lost them. They are engaging in more healthy community practices where they can help to heal each other and hopefully continue, like you disrupt the trauma and continue a healthy way of healing. I mentioned the adoption project before. This was administered by the Child Welfare League of America and funded by a federal contract from the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the U.S. Children's Bureau. The Indian Adoption Project lasted from 1958 through 1967. And also, the concurrent and following method of removal was the Indian Relocation Program of the 1950s. And before Alvin talks to you in greater detail about that, I wanted to leave you with another impact that you may not have considered. Today, nearly 7 out of every 10 American Indians and Alaskan Natives, 2.8 million, live in or near cities, and that number is growing. Some urban Native Indians are members of the 562 federally recognized tribes and are thus entitled to certain federal healthcare benefits. With the bulk of these services provided only on reservations, this makes access difficult for those in cities. Other members of the 109 tribes that the government terminated in the 1950s, without this federally recognized status, members of these tribes do not qualify for federal Indian health provided by the Indian Health Services or tribally run hospitals and clinics. Legislation enacted and treaties signed during the last century guaranteed health care for American Indian and Alaskan natives. But for the most part, recent policies have stripped many of them of their rights to health care when they move to cities. Today's urban Indians are most likely the products of failed federal government policies that facilitated the urbanization of Indians, and the lack of sufficient aid to assure access with this transition has placed them at a greater health risk. Competition for scarce resources further limits financial help to address the health problems faced by urban Indians. And this was from a document, an executive summary, the Urban Indian Health Commission, Invisible Tribes, Urban Indians and Their Health in a Changing World, from 2007. So in 2007, we might have culturally accepted the term Indians, but today, if that same article were rewritten, we might use some other terms. So I wanted to address that too. So I think that's enough to go over for now. And I look forward to your questions when we have time for those. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much. Our next speaker is Reverend Alvin Deere, a clergy member of the Oklahoma Indian Missionary Conference and former executive director of NAIC. He wrote the 1996 Methodist Apology for the Sand Creek Massacre and has advocated for healing and reconciliation throughout his ministry. We welcome Alvin Deere.
Thank you for this opportunity to speak about a program that is not well known in the general population. It's called the Indian Relocation Program. I wanted to give an introductory background statement before I get into that subject. The Doctrine of Discovery is on the table of many places to have it eradicated. At the United Nations, I found a statement on May 8th of 2012 where they have what's called the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues at the United Nations, and they issued a report where it began, the Doctrine of Discovery had been used for centuries to expropriate indigenous lands and facilitate their transfer to colonizing or dominating nations. And this doctrine is the foundation of many laws that subjugate the rights of indigenous peoples even into the 21st century. One of the most recent and little-known traumas inflicted on Native peoples by the US government is an outgrowth of the Doctrine of Discovery, which was a program what the Bureau of Indian Affairs called the Voluntary Relocation Program. It was a program that provided a one-way transportation and if a couple of $100 to Native Americans willing to move into the city. One BIA commissioner would later call the program an underfunded, ill-conceived, essentially one-way ticket from rural poverty to urban poverty. This program came about after a post-World War II report was issued to try and solve what was called the Indian problem. The Indian problem has been around for 500 years and they haven't solved it yet. Solving the Indian problem took many forms over 200 years of colonialism, including wars, Indian removal, such as the Indian Removal Act that removed the southeastern tribes into Oklahoma. My father's people were people that came over on the Trail of Tears. And then there was other Indian removals that were called the longest walk, such as the Dene people, the Navajo, and other tribes, the Cheyenne, they all had what they called the longest walk. And now In 1956, another removal act was being placed on Native communities and reservations nationwide, and it was called the Indian Removal Act. It became a law. It is said that the post-war economic boom that was hitting America failed to impact the reservations and Native communities nationwide. The report said, and it was known as the Hoover Report. It was named after Herbert Hoover. It said that there, meaning the indigenous communities, their standard of living is low, and there's a serious problem in maintaining their health. Educating them properly has proved extremely difficult, said the report. Given the apparent inability of the federal government, it goes on to say, over a period of more than 100 years to free itself from responsibilities for their activities, the problem looms large indeed. And so the goal of the Indian relocation was to move Native Americans to cities where they would disappear through assimilation into white America mainstream. Then the government planned to take tribal land and make them taxable and available for purchase and development by non-natives. The vision was eventually that there would be no more Bureau of Indian Affairs, no more tribal governments, no more reservations. In other words, another form of American genocide. This campaign failed to wipe out tribes, but it did fuel a massive migration that fundamentally changed Indian country. Kimberly mentioned that today that as much as 78% of Native Americans live in cities now and not on reservations. But the economic and psychological wounds are visible in the cities today. On nearly every measure of education, employment, and health, Native people rank near or at the bottom. The solution they proposed was to assimilate Native Americans into white America and eliminate tribal governments and reservations. And in 1956, like I mentioned, the Indian Relocation Act was enacted. And I want to speak about the relocation experience from a personal point of view. I grew up in Los Angeles. I was born at the Indian Hospital in Lawton, Oklahoma, but my grandmother took me and my twin brother out to Los Angeles to be with my father, who went to Los Angeles after World War II. And this was about 12 years before the Indian Relocation Act, or maybe 10 years. I was shocked to find out that the Hoover Commission justified moving tens of thousands of Native Americans off reservations and Indian communities by saying that Native people did not want to be Indian anymore. I was always proud to be Native. In LA, they didn't believe Indians existed anymore. I always say that they thought John Wayne had shot them all and they were at the bottom of their TVs. When I told them I was Native, they would say, "No, you're not. Say something in Indian." But there's a disturbing statistic that remains constant over the 20 years in the 20th and 21st century that has always been at my heart. And that is young natives have the highest rates of suicide in America. Why? And I made it my lifelong journey to find out why and see where I could help alleviate that kind of experience. My experience with the relocation program was both painful and heartbreaking. But I personally also witnessed Native families pulling themselves out of poverty and finding success in the urban area. The Hoover Commission report matter-of-factly said the Indian population is no longer a pure ethnic group. Rather, it represents an assortment of full bloods and people of mixed ancestry. There is a movie that depicts the life in Los Angeles after the Relocation Act was put into place, and thousands of Native Americans moved to the greater Los Angeles. This movie was called The Exiles, and I wanted to share it, the poster of it, because it's a dark poster because the movie is dark. It is an accurate account of the life of young families struggle with urban life and our need to find people just like us. There are two bars in that movie that were on Skid Row in downtown Los Angeles. They were actual places where Native people congregated. I went there in my younger days. I will say that many Natives became alcoholics and families broke up after they moved to Los Angeles. I can't imagine being promised a new and better life and then finding all the alcohol and other abuses and the pressures of urban living in the 50s and the 60s. And so that movie, I think if you have an opportunity to watch it, I would encourage you maybe to do that. But to be honest with you, there were success stories, however few and far between. There was another preposterous solution they proposed to assimilate Native Americans into white America and eliminate tribal government and reservations and communities. There was a report made on the Pine Ridge Reservation in South Dakota, and it spent several pages detailing the marriage trends between full bloods, half bloods, and quarter bloods. You see, to be a Native American of a federal recognized tribe, we have to have a card that says how much degree of Indian blood we have. And the report stated that well-adjusted and self-sufficient mixed blood families that is occasionally seen has tempted some observers, now get this, to conclude that intermarriage between Indians and whites will solve many of the cultural problems of the Indian group. However, that wasn't enough. There wasn't enough intermarriage between whites and Native people, the author lamented. And he said, it is thus evident that the Indian problem again, the Indian problem is not going to be solved through the disappearance of Indians by intermarriage with non-Indians. This report was published in 1955. And at that time, and I think even today, for Black people, if you have one drop of Black blood, you are considered Black. But white America believed Indianness could be washed away in just a few generations through intermarriage with whites. And this contradictory logic was self-serving for white America. More Black Americans meant more workers to exploit. Fewer Native Americans meant more land to take. And in line with this self-serving logic, federal politicians and bureaucrats believed Native Americans wanted to melt away into the mainstream. But in actuality, the relocation program created what I considered viable Indian communities in urban areas. And that was my experience in Los Angeles. Community centers were formed. The Los Angeles Indian Center has been around now for 70 years. And my grandmother was on the board, and I used to, I remember lots of memories of the LA Indian Center. Native churches sprang up. There were at least 7 Native churches that sprang up in Southern California. And we would have church like we have back here in Oklahoma. We'd have our 4th Sunday dinners, and we'd bring out all the Native foods that we would make, and we would enjoy, you might say, our culture that way. Indian athletic leagues were formed. And I know that the Los Angeles Indian Athletics, they had 24 men teams, and they had about 8 or 12 women teams. And they travel, and the relocation Indian teams travel to reservations and other areas where tournaments were held. And we held our own. The Los Angeles, the best team in LA was called the Jayhawks, Kansas Jayhawks, because all the players, all the players had gone to Haskell Indian boarding school. The first Native American to play professional basketball was a man named Pete Homer, a Mojave from Arizona, who played for the Anaheim, California team in the Old American Basketball Association. Also in Los Angeles, the Indian Actors Workshop was formed by Jay Silverhills, a Mohawk, who is best known as Tonto in the Lone Ranger series. But Native people had been appearing in Hollywood movies since the 1920s. But in the 1950s and 1960s, there were well over 40 Natives who made a living working in Hollywood, including my father. I conclude by saying that the families that stayed in Southern California and are still there today overcame poverty and social dysfunction and are doing okay. There's no statistics for me to go back on, but I'm in contact with many of my relatives and friends that grew up in Los Angeles. The program's goal for the Indian in us to disappear, but did not happen. We seem to survive whatever genocidal tactics, however subtle, they throw at us. We seem to survive. I just want to say in my Kiowa language, Obaha, Deonde, Dog Ki. And that says, I'm finished. Thank you, God. I'll turn it back over.
Thank you, Alvin, and thank you, Kimberly. Also, I'm David Wildman with Global Ministries of the United Methodist Church, and one of the co-sponsors of these webinars is the United Methodist for Kairos Response that has been responding to the calls from Indigenous Palestinian Christians. And so I just want to express my thanks briefly and say a word that we've been doing other webinars as well, alternating with these around the similar dynamics of settler colonial theology in Palestine and Israel today, and the dispossession from the land. And there's so many comparisons. I don't want to go into all that now, but I do want to just highlight how this kind of doctrine of discovery colonial thinking has played itself out in so many ways that we've just heard, of relocation, of really removing people from the land, and how important that is in the colonial agenda to erase identity that we've heard about and erase connections to the land. And so I really appreciate Kimberly and Alvin, how you've lifted that up. I'll note one other thing, that just last week, Amnesty International, as an international human rights organization that's dealt with many, many human rights issues, issued a report on Israeli apartheid, where there was a creation of two sets of laws that applied differently, and one for Israeli Jews, one for Palestinians, all of which was to remove Palestinians from the land and to not deny any connection that they had to the land there. And so I invite you, next month we'll have another webinar around Israel-Palestine, but I just wanted to kind of add this little piece of connection that for me has been very powerful, that we in the churches as United Methodists primarily, although I know we have many ecumenical colleagues here, need to examine the log in our own eye of how our theology has played a part of this in terms of the dispossession from land and the erasing of identity and the impact on children that we've heard so powerfully from Kimberly and Alvin. And so while I want to turn the rest of the time devote to you answering questions and sharing more comments, I do want to just challenge those of us who are not Native to see the ways that we can learn from these struggles, to take on the struggles ourselves in our churches, in the ongoing work of justice and restoring relationships of people to the land. Thank you.
Thank you, David. We're going to make a bit of space and time. I want to introduce Raggy Rain, who is the convener of the Native American International Caucus. And she's going to share a little bit about some work that NAIC has been doing around the boarding schools and our call to the United Methodist Church. I won't be able to, she won't be able to take her, you won't be able to see her, but we'll be able to hear her. So.
Right. We can now sneak taps. I can only say simple words of Wanishi to Reverend Alvin Deere and Kimberly for their good work and their truth telling. It is so important that we listen to these words and take to heart what has happened in the past but continues to live on today. So let me begin. The nighttime sky was still upon us. You could hear Mama in the kitchen preparing our morning meal. 7-year-old girl child woke up and she knew it was time to begin the morning cheers. Slipping from her bed, she pulled on her boots, still wearing a tattered nightgown and tangled hair. She moved quickly across the floor to the back door. Beside the door, there were a row of hooks, and on those hooks hung every family member's coat. Her fingertips touched her coat, and she lifted herself up on her tiptoes and lifted that coat down. A coat that had been worn by so many children before her, but for this year and the years to come, it would be her coat alone, and she hugged it tightly. The back door flew open. She fell backwards as she saw her father standing in that doorway. He was soaking wet from his head to the bottom of his feet. No words did he speak as he shut the door. He roughly took that coat from her hands and hung it back up. And he turned and he walked across the room, speaking no words. There was a storm brewing outside, but there was a bigger storm brewing inside of her. Why did he speak no words? Why did he not say her name? Why did he not love her? What had she done to be so unlovable? Her mother turned and slipped her hand into her apron pocket and pulled out a comb, motioning for her to comb that tangled mess. As she went to take that comb, her father roughly grabbed it, motioned for her to sit down. She was an obedient child. She knew how to listen. And for the first time in her life, and she didn't know it then, it would be the last time, he began to comb her hair with such gentleness, unlike her mother's hurried ways. It was though he was combing into her hair all the love that he had for her, but he could not show all the words he wanted to share with her, but he could not speak. October 6th, 1879, Carlisle opened the first off the reservation boarding school under direction of Richard Pratt. His motto was simple: kill the Indian and save the man by any means necessary. By any means necessary. We know this to be true, and we think about all of the horrific things that happen to the children, but not just to the children, but to their families and their communities. I have heard people say to me that was in the past. But there are children who are grown adults now who still suffer those consequences of boarding schools. And this will continue until we have programs and teachings like Reverend Alvin Deere and Kimberly. These are important things and messages that they are giving. So let us all open our hearts. The Native American International Caucus has spoken twice with statements asking that a full investigation be done into the 12 boarding schools that they operated, and to share with the world what happened in those schools. There is no way that we can turn back the hands of time, but there is a way we can walk beside each other and speak truth. And so we ask that, for the children's names still need to be spoken. Their families still need to have their children returned to them that lay beneath a key Earth Mother. We ask you to walk with us and encourage the leadership of the United Methodist Church to commission Gary Roberts to begin to write the truth. The one who wrote the truth of Sand Creek Massacre, and to work closely with our elders and with those who have suffered the tragedy of being a victim of our boarding schools. Wanishi.
Thank you, Aggie. I've shared a link to the NAIC call to the Council of Bishops in the chat, so you can see that and continue to share the word. Now we're going to have some time to ask some questions of our speakers. Please feel free to continue to put your questions into the chat. Our first question is just a few questions. So I'm going to put kind of like 3 questions together. And I'm wondering if Kimberly can start with these, and Alvin, if you have anything to add, we'll make space for that too. But did the boarding schools use older students to indoctrinate younger ones? Are there boarding schools today? And what are current efforts for reparations?
Great questions. Some of the accounts that I have read in terms of older students recruiting younger students to go to the boarding schools exist. For example, Luther Standing Bear was one of the first students to go to Carlisle Indian Industrial School. And later on, when he was older, he would travel back to his reservation and recruit students to go to the boarding school. So that may be a partial answer to that question. Another thing that happened is because so many students were suffering abuses, sometimes what would happen is the older students would turn around and abuse the younger students that were in that school. So that is a whole nother study in terms of what conditions were like in the boarding schools. Let's see, what was the third part of the question? What's being done now?
What are current efforts for reparations?
So we know from back in October, when there were remains that were found in the Kamloops School in British Columbia, that seemed to spark more interest in what was going on in the boarding schools in the United States, even though research has been conducted for a good 10 years prior to that. But according to the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, there is a Truth and Healing Commission on Indian Boarding School Policies in the US Act HR 544 and S 2907. So we know that in Canada, there's a Truth and Reconciliation Act, and my understanding is that that took 10 years to compile just to make the document. So it would seem that the United States is interested in doing something like that. I'm not going to say anything definitely. I think that's the direction that things are moving, but reparations can take a long time. You know, even though we may want to see immediate action, there are a lot of things that have to fall into place for those things to happen. I would say reclaiming language still is something that's going on. Some of the tribes have their own language programs for students even today. So those are wonderful things that are happening. Boarding schools for Indigenous people now that are run by Indigenous people that encourage the expression of art and literature and learning tribal law, things like those. We are advancing, but it's going to take some time. So yes, there are boarding schools that run today, but they're not the assimilative boarding schools that we saw during the boarding school era. Alvin, do you have anything to add to that?
No, although I think it is bringing awareness to many areas of the country and Canada. I know in Oklahoma, we just had an article in our newspaper on the Oklahoma boarding schools, and they're continuing to do research on that. And 60 Minutes 2 weeks ago did a segment on the boarding schools, I believe.
Thank you. Missing, murdered, and Indigenous women continues to be a priority issue. Can either of you address how communities are addressing this issue? Can we start with Alvin?
Yeah, we were going to have a speaker specifically on the murdered and missing Indigenous women. In Oklahoma, we have at least 2 chapters on the MMIW that is bringing information to the forefront. Matter of fact, our last webinar, we had Lorenda Morgan, who had a law passed in Oklahoma to help evidently law enforcement agencies aren't working together when they have a case. They're not working together and those cases get stalled. So they passed what's called the IDA law, which was her first cousin. I was pastor to IDA back in the 80s, and also to Lorenda. I was their pastor. And IDA has been missing since 2005. I believe it's 2005. Also, I have a daughter who was murdered. And she's part of the list that we have of Oklahoma murdered and missing Indigenous women. And there is what they call the Indian Capital Chapter and the Oklahoma chapter, but they have different chapters of the MMIW coalition.
Kimberly, do you have anything else you want to add to that?
I know with the murdered and missing Indigenous women, we can look to the man camps that were constructed for oil pipelines and things like that. They often, the communities that these transitory workers live, bring in so much devastation and decline in terms of drug trafficking, sex trafficking, everything that you can think of that goes along with our women that go missing. And there's all, you know, there's the red dress campaign. I know a lot of Native women that produce beadwork that has to do, or even ribbon skirts now that have the symbols for the murdered and missing Indigenous women. And it's something that mainstream society may not know enough about. And I believe once they do, I am hopeful that things will turn around. But again, it's something that's going to take time. And then up in Canada, the Highway of Tears, I think it is. Somebody can correct me on that, because I feel like the name isn't correct. The same is happening for women, and now also for men too, Indigenous men. So there's a lot of things that are going on. Still so many methods of removal to our current day.
Yes, and might mention I about 10 years ago was at a Native gathering where they brought out the South Dakota motorcycle rally. What's that called? Sturgis. That there's a lot of Native young women who are from neighboring reservations there who turn up missing after the rally.
Our last webinar did focus more on missing and murdered Indigenous women, and you can find that recording. I'm going to post a link in the chat. You can find that and the other past recordings there as well. Another question here. Do you know where the 12 United Methodist boarding schools are located? And another question, are there similar indoctrination and assimilation centered boarding schools in other areas of the world, or is that unique to North America?
Good question. I know if you look at the Methodist archives, mission archives that are specific to your area, I don't fully understand how the Methodist Church breaks down their regional or geographical areas, but there's information that can be found of the locations of the boarding schools and how long they operated and things like that, as can be done with other denominations too. I know that globally, Indigenous populations, friends that I have in Australia, talk about the inherent racism and just devastating treatment of the Aboriginal or Indigenous people there. So I can't say for sure that there were the same type of assimilative boarding schools there, because I don't want to misspeak, but it's something that would be interesting for further investigation. I know that there are also a lot of difficulties between building relationships between Australia, Indigenous people, and churches for the genocidal practices that have been enacted against them. Most of the people, Indigenous people that I know within the NAIC, the North American Institute of Indigenous Theological Studies, learning community, all speak of different types of genocidal practices that have gone on in their countries. So I can say that for sure.
Do you have anything to add?
Who, me? Oh, David.
No, that's good. I mean, yeah, I would say that there's also the Commission of Archives of the United Methodist Churches gathered a lot. And I know the example in Sand Creek, there was a local United Methodist church that tried to work with the sort of reparations of acknowledging what had happened because of the Methodist commander that was in charge of the massacre there in Sand Creek. So they're digging more locally. There's a lot of archives that have been saved, but it's a struggle to kind of dig those out and surface them.
I think some of the earlier documents I have seen have called it the Methodist Episcopal Archive. So
Yeah.
it would seem that those two were connected at one time.
Well, the
We're
Methodist
not-
Church was called the Methodist Episcopal Church before we became United Methodists. And will become
Not United
ununited.
Methodist. The United Methodist term started in 1968. So you need to look at Methodist Episcopal Church, the Methodist Episcopal Church South and North. They divided over slavery as well. So yeah, there's a lot of different Methodist portions of the family, as well as the Evangelical United Brethren. And I don't know if there were any of the schools were related to the Evangelical United Brethren component of the United Methodist history.
You know, it's difficult to find all the information compiled in one place. It's as if someone from the government and someone from the churches and education just took all the information and scattered it all over the place. So it doesn't make sense sometimes when you're trying to find information for one part of the country to go to a completely different part of the country, and the records might be in a repository there. So you really have to be determined and intentional to find out any information that you want.
Well, thank you all. We haven't been able to answer every single, but we're really grateful to Kimberly and Alvin. We invite you to our last session of our webinar series, Undoing the Doctrine, Developing a Theology of Repentance and Repair. That'll be on April 13th at 1 p.m. Eastern. I'm also going to put that in the chat as well, so you can have that. Thank you all so much for joining us, and I hope that you will join us at our next webinar.